Welcome to Nalf's Nonsense. Guys, in this video, I am going to very oversimplify some really complicated stuff. There are longer videos out there with more in-detailed explanations, but what I'm trying to do here for you is a very simplified version so you have a small grasp of the basics of this situation. By now, anyone with access to the internet is aware of what is going on in Ukraine. Russia has invaded Ukraine, starting a war, basically the most intense and largest scale war in Europe since World War II. Now on my other channel, Nalf, I'll probably talk about the more subjective and emotional aspects of this, but for now I'm going to just be sticking to facts. The majority of nations have fully condemned Vladimir Putin's actions and Russia's actions in Ukraine, imposing harsh sanctions to Russia in an attempt to cripple their economy. If you look at a map of Europe, basically every European nation has agreed to do this. Some nations that are historically neutral, such as Switzerland and Sweden and Finland, are actually taking steps to support Ukraine in that way. But if you look at a map, there are two countries, basically one, because one of them's Belarus, and Belarus, I don't even count as a legitimate country right now. They're just a puppet state of Putin's, run by a yes boy dictator who just does whatever Putin says. So Belarus is an extension of Russia, in my opinion. But the one country that has not supported the sanctions against Russia is Serbia. Why? In order to understand this, we've got to go back to the 90s. This little country right here, Kosovo. Now, Kosovo is currently a partially recognized nation. It is currently recognized by 97 members of the United Nations, but Serbia does not recognize Kosovo as its own nation, and it claims that Kosovo is a part of Serbia still today. Now, we can go into a full deep dive on the conflict between Serbia and Albania and the Kosovo situation. That would take an hour. So what you need to know is that there is this strong disagreement between Serbians and Kosovar Albanians. The Kosovar Albanians claim that Kosovo is its own sovereign country and belongs to them, whereas Serbs in Serbia claim that Kosovo, this region, they call it a region, is actually a part of Serbia.
Serbs considered and say that Kosovo is their Jerusalem. It was the sort of heart of Serbia.
To this day, Kosovo is still divided along ethnic lines.
Now, in the 90s, this disagreement got so heated to the point where Serbia started committing a genocide against ethnic Albanians who claimed Kosovo as their own region. Serbia had the power of the state of Yugoslavia behind them, and so there was a huge disbalance in power. And they used this power in an attempt to cleanse Albanians from Kosovo and keep it as their own. It got so bad to the point where NATO actually stepped in. Now, this marked the first time that NATO had used military operations without the express permission and authority of the UN Security Council's permanent members. These are the permanent members of the UN Security Council, and Russia did not approve of these bombings. Russia is on Serbia's side in this conflict between Serbia and Kosovar Albanians. So the fact that NATO went ahead anyway and bombed the Serbian capital of Belgrade did not sit well with Russia. Russia interpreted this as the West, NATO, using its powers to influence culture and borders in the Balkan region, and a region that Russia typically thought was in their sphere of influence. And since those bombings in 1999, Russia has maintained that Kosovo is actually a part of Serbia. So while Kosovo has its own government, and like I said, 97 members of the United Nations recognize them as their own country, Serbia still claims that Kosovo is just a region, an area in Serbia. And Russia backs these claims, which it seems Serbia is very appreciative of. So Serbia is now in a pretty complicated situation because they have officially petitioned to join the EU. But at the same time, they are refusing to impose these sanctions against Russia. Actually, flights from Belgrade to Russia have increased, seeing as how all the other European nations refuse to service Russian airplanes and airports. One thing to keep in mind in this kind of stuff is that the people of a country are not the government. When I'm saying Russia or Serbia, I am talking about the government, not the individual human beings who live in these countries. I'm American. I do not necessarily feel represented by my US government, and I'm sure a lot of Russians and a lot of Serbians feel the exact same way. The Serbian president has said, "Serbia is in an exceptionally difficult situation. There is less understanding than ever for the position of our nation. We are facing huge pressure." So Serbia as a state is not necessarily supporting the Russian invasion. They have said Serbia respects the norms of the international law, but Serbia also understands its own interests. So its support is more of a tacit approval. By not joining the rest of the EU nations in these sanctions, they are basically tacitly, passively approving of Russia's actions. So that is a wildly oversimplification of a very complicated issue, but that is why when you look at a map of which countries are supporting Russia, Serbia is the only one. Thank you for listening to my nonsense.